We are now going to get into describing attributes, and we are going to be very systematic with our approach to instruction. Being systematic means that we provide very clear, explicit instruction when we're working on foundational content, and we do that so that students can engage in transfer and inquiry. Let's go ahead and get started. There's 4 different areas that we are going to talk about. The first is comparing and measuring attributes. So what do we mean when we're talking about an attribute? Well, an attribute is a characteristic of a number, a figure, an operation, equation, or an inequality. And some of the attributes that are important when it comes to measurement include the following. So height, length, weight, volume, and surface area. Now, one of the things we can think about is, well, what are the attributes of a specific shape? In this example, what would be the attributes of a hexagon? So we could talk about the length of each of the sides of this hexagon. We could talk maybe about the height of the hexagon. We could also talk about, well, what color is this hexagon? We can also think about attributes that aren't on this list as well. So let's think about the steps for measuring. First, we want to decide the attribute to be measured. So our question is, what is being measured? In this picture, I might be measuring those paper clips, I might be measuring that bucket, or I might be measuring the height of those purple cubes. The second thing I'm going to do is select a unit that has that attribute. So what unit might be reasonable? Maybe if I'm measuring those paper clips, maybe a reasonable unit might be centimeters. What if I'm measuring the height of those purple cubes? Maybe a reasonable unit might be centimeters or inches. Or what if I'm measuring the weight of that bucket? Well, that might be in pounds. Then I'm going to identify the instrument for measurement. So I should ask myself, what instrument or tool measures those units that I have selected? So maybe I'm going to use something that shows centimeters, maybe that's a ruler, maybe I'm going to use a tape measure, or maybe I'm going to use a scale. And fourth, I will compare the object being measured to the unit. So how many units is the object? The number of units required to match the object is the measure. So those are some steps that are important to think about as we ask students to start to measure different things in their environment. Now, as we do that, we want to explicitly link measuring and comparing. So we measure with a unit, and then measuring is a process of comparing attributes. Let's try one of these together. First, I want to think about what is the attribute to be measured if I'm interested in how tall is this sunflower. So if I'm thinking about the attribute here, the attribute is height. And then what is the unit where I could measure height? Well, perhaps I want to measure this sunflower in inches. Then what instrument could be used to measure in the chosen units? Well, I could think about using a measuring tape or maybe a ruler. And then how many units is the sunflower? Well, that's to be determined. Now we can talk a lot about measurement with pictures such as the one you see here, but it's even better to do some hands-on measurement. So let's look at a few examples of hands-on measurement where we can think about our 4 steps for model measuring. Let's take these 2 objects and use our 4 steps to figure out how to measure these objects. Let's focus on this tower of cubes. First, I want to figure out what attribute am I interested in. Here, I'm interested in the height of this tower. Second, I want to think about the units. I would like to know the height of this tower in inches. So then third, I think about my tool. Here, I might be interested in measuring this in inches using a ruler, such as this. And then fourth, I figure out, well, what is the measurement of this tower of cubes? And it is about 5.5 inches. Now, what if I was looking at this pin right here? The attribute that I want to look at first is I want to figure out the length of this pen. And then I second want to think about, well, what units might I use? I don't want to know this in inches, but now I want to know this in centimeters. So third, what tool would I use? Well, maybe I use a centimeter ruler like this. So fourth, I figure out that this pen is 5 centimeters in length. Now I could do one more here. I could figure out, well, I'm interested in the length of my workspace as you see it. So I want to figure out the length across. Then I want to do that in inches. And what might be a good tool to do that? Well, I could use a measuring tape. So I'm going to get my measuring tape out here, and I'm going to go ahead and bring it into my workspace as you see. So if I'm measuring my workspace from one side to the other, I see that the length, well, goodness, what do we got here, is almost 19 inches. It gets us, well, let's see. It's hard for me to see it there. Yeah, it's just about 19 or 19 and a half inches. So this was another tool that I could use to help me do some measuring. There are a lot of other tools that you might consider using. We'll talk about some of those forthcoming. Now, as students start to measure, there's two types of comparison. There's direct comparison, where one object can be lined up and measured against another. So you see an example of that here with our stapler compared to our marker. But then there's indirect comparison, where we can use a third object to then compare two objects that can't easily be compared. So an example of this is as such. Let's say I want to compare the circumference of my wrist to, I'll say, like the length of my palm right here. Well, I can't compare those directly, right? I really can't do that easily. But I could use a piece of string, and I could tie a piece of string around my wrist to figure out the circumference. And then I could take that piece of string and compare it to this length of my palm right there. So that would be an example of an indirect comparison. So here are some pictures that might be helpful if you're thinking about that indirect comparison. One of the other things that I'd like you to think about as we focus on early measurement is being precise with our language. I want you to go back to thinking about when I showed that stapler compared to the marker. Instead of saying the stapler is bigger than the marker, well, what was I comparing there? I was comparing the length. So it'd be more precise to say that the stapler was longer than the marker. So thinking about that precise use of mathematical language leads us to this pause. And think about one example of a direct comparison, and then what would be one example of an indirect comparison.